Welcome to Dungeon Academics. I am Thomas and I will be your instructor. This video is the Ability Score Arbitration, a look into how games create characters and the different systems for allocating starting abilities. Character creation is one of my favourite parts of role-playing games. Creating a new alter ego from scratch, imagining the adventures they will go on, the great feats they will achieve, and from humble beginnings, how they will grow into a fabled hero. One common thread to almost all role-playing games is setting ability scores, and through many games there are almost as many different ways of determining what these core values of your character will be. Games tend to have a wide range of what ability scores are considered important and how many they use, and that's probably a future video. But here are 4 from games that I am somewhat familiar with. Can you recognise them all? These games each use a variety of methods to determine these ability scores, and using terminology familiar to Dungeons & Dragons players, they can be classified as rolling, point buy, or standard array. Note that not all games use all of these 3 methods. Some may exclusively use only one. On a more emotional level, rolling ability scores is the most gamey of the 3 options. There is something to be said for letting fate take control through the dice. Even within rolling, there are many different systems available, but the 2 most common variants involve either straight or selective rolling, and 3d6 versus roll 4 drop 1, often abbreviated to R4D1. With straight rolling, you allocate the ability scores in the order you roll them. Your first result will be your strength, your second, dexterity, and so on. This truly leaves your character's future in the hands of fate. No point in playing a rogue if you roll low for dexterity and great on wisdom, and good luck playing a paladin if you are relying on high rolls for 3 of your 6 ability scores. This method is best if you don't mind picking a class after you have rolled your abilities. Selective rolling is much more popular, as it allows you to roll your 6 ability scores, then allocate the results wherever you want them. The maths behind the rolls is the same, but the flexibility in choosing where the results go allows players to build the character they have already created in their mind. I would suggest that any game with rolled ability scores should use the selective score allocation method. I recently finished a fantastic Call of Cthulhu campaign in which my character, a middle-aged paracosmology professor, happened to be a 2-meter tall Olympian with a rippling six-pack due to an unlikely high roll on size and strength. Selective ability score rolling would have allowed a more reasonable ability score allocation and a character closer to what I had in mind, though I must confess that his stature allowed for some interesting story points that I wouldn't have pursued otherwise. The mathematics behind the choice of rolling 3d6 or roll 4 drop 1 is interesting enough to go into. Each one returns a score of between 3 and 18, but have distinctly different distributions. From the table you can see that 3d6 produces an even number of high and low results, a symmetrical distribution, whereas roll 4 drop 1 returns fewer low results and more high results. Note that the frequency columns look significantly different, as 3d6 generates 6 to the 3rd power, or 216 results, whereas roll 4 drop 1 returns 6 to the 4th power, or 1296 results. The difference is eliminated by looking at the percentages of each result. Rolling 3d6, shown in blue, returns a familiar bell curve-like shape, as we learned about in the Fireball fiasco. But the distribution curve for roll 4 drop 1, shown in red, is skewed to the higher values. This is clearer to see in a cumulative frequency chart. The blue curve of 3d6 rises faster, meaning that a higher proportion of values occur earlier and therefore lower. 3d6 has its lowest 25% of results by the score of 8, whereas roll 4 drop 1 has its lowest 25% by the score of 10. This spread continues for the lowest half of results, with 3d6 having its median value at 10, but roll 4 drop 1 has its median at 12. The top 25% of results for 3d6 are 12 and higher, but for roll 4 drop 1 they are over 14. Roll 4 drop 1 across most probabilities seems to be returning about 2 points more than 3d6. Let's try a quantitative approach. Remembering that the mean of a die is equal to the number of sides plus 1 all over 2, and that when rolling multiple dice you can add the means together, the mean on 3d6 will be 10.5. To find the standard deviation of 3d6, we must first find the variance of 1d6. The variance of a value is called sigma squared. We can use the formula n squared minus 1 all over 12 and find that the variance of 1d6 is around 1.71. The variance of 3d6 is 3 times the variance of 1d6, and from there we can find the standard deviation, sigma, by taking the square root of the variance. We find that the standard deviation of 3d6 is around 2.96. This approach does not work for roll 4 drop 1. Instead, I generated all 1,296 results in a spreadsheet, then found the mean and standard deviation analytically. The mean comes to around 12.2, 1.7 more than for 3d6. The standard deviation comes to around 2.85, a little less than that for 3d6. This means that roll 4 drop 1 returns a significantly higher mean and a lower standard deviation, meaning a tighter distribution. I find it always interesting to look at edge cases. For both 3d6 and roll 4 drop 1, the minimum and maximum values you can roll are 3 and 18. For 3d6, these edge cases are equally likely, or unlikely, 1 in 216, or about 0.5%. The chance of rolling these extreme values for all 6 of your ability scores is easy to calculate. It's the probability of it happening once raised to the power of 6. As you can see, these are incredibly unlikely. You have a 1 in 102 trillion chance of getting 6 ability scores of 3, and the same chance of getting 6 scores of 18. Using roll 4 drop 1 gives very different results. The chance of getting a score of 3 is even less likely, as you would need to roll all 4 dice as a 1. That's a 1 in 1,296 chance. The chance of it happening all 6 times is thus even smaller, 1 in 4.73 billion. Getting a score of 18 is much more likely, over 3 times when compared to rolling 3d6. There are 21 ways of scoring 18 using roll 4 drop 1, and thus the chance of a score of 18 is about 1.54%. This would be a great way to introduce binomial probability, but that will have to wait for another day. The odds of this happening 6 times is still negligible, a mere 1 in 55 billion, but that makes it about 1,800 times more likely than getting straight 18s with 3d6. Either way, this is still highly unlikely, and I doubt that 55 billion characters will be generated anytime soon. Now we can look at some distributions for both 3d6 and roll 4 drop 1. 3d6 creates a distribution that approaches normal. Can we assume that when rolling 6 ability scores, the total will also be normally distributed? This is worth considering. Given that each ability score has a minimum rolled value of 3 and a maximum of 18, we can see that the total rolled abilities will have a range between 18 and 108. The mean of each ability score rolled this way is 10.5, so the mean of the total should be 6 times higher, at 63. Finally, the variance of 3d6 is 8.75, so the variance of all 6 should be exactly 52.5, and thus the standard deviation is around 7.24. Using a spreadsheet, I rolled 100,000 ability score arrays using 3d6. The total ability scores came to between 34 and 93, and created a distribution that looks like this, a very clear bell curve. The mean score rolled was 63, as predicted, and the variance is 52.5, and thus the standard deviation 7.24, also as predicted. From this we can conclude that the total of ability scores is indeed normally distributed. Of interest, the lowest ability score array rolled came to a very low total of 34 and was 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 and 8, and the highest had a total of 93 and was 17, 17, 17, 16, 14 and 12. We can come back to these later, but first we should look at roll 4 drop 1. The minimum and maximum score will still be 18 and 108. But do the mean and standard deviation work the same way? Can we just add the means and variances of the individual ability scores, even though they aren't normally distributed themselves? We can find out the same way as before using some spreadsheet wizardry. Let's first assume that this is the way it works. Then the mean will become 12.2 times 6, or around 73.5. Note that I'm using more significant figures in my calculation and rounding solutions. The variance should be 8.1 times 6, which is 48.6, and thus the standard deviation should be around 6.97. Here is the distribution of 100,000 arrays I rolled. It also looks very normal, but how do the statistics measure up? The mean of these arrays comes to 73.5, a perfect match, and the standard deviation is 6.96, an almost perfect match. With the shape of the curve and the values calculated, I can determine that the results are normally distributed. Maybe one day I will find a reason to add hypothesis testing to a video and show quantitatively how good a match it is. Of note is that the lowest array rolled came to 42 points, with a 4, 5, 6, 7, 9 and 11, and the highest came to 100, with 18, 18, 18, 17, 16 and 13. The D&D Beyond player data for 2023 tells us that 3.2 million player characters were made through it in that year. This represents an unknown fraction of the total player characters made during the year, and we have no information on how the ability scores were generated, but it is reasonable to assume that the number of ability score arrays generated using roll 4 drop 1 is in the millions per year, at least over the last few years of Dungeons & Dragons' heightened popularity. This ties in to our results in an interesting way. Focusing on just roll 4 drop 1 as the most popular ability score generating method, our top result is a 1 in 100,000 event. But across a million characters, it should happen 10 times. And if a potential 10 million player characters have been rolled in history, these results are merely top 1%. There will be real characters that have been used by players with better and worse ability scores than the best and worst ones shown here. It is somewhat sobering to think that a player has likely rolled a character with a total ability score of less than 40. I hope they were allowed to retire peacefully to a farm. Before we go much further, let's quickly look at the other two main ways to generate ability scores: standard array and point buy. Standard array offers a set of 6 ability scores to be allocated wherever a player decides, specifically 15, 14, 13, 12, 10 and 8. This is a total of 72, putting it in the bottom half of results when compared to roll 4 drop 1, specifically in the bottom 42% of results. Point buy offers players a base of 8 in each ability score and 27 points to spend to increase them. It costs 1 point to raise an ability score by 1 up to a score of 13. It costs 2 points to increase it to 14 and another 2 to raise it to 15, which is the maximum score allowed. One can choose to raise a number of ability scores to the highest value possible and leave the rest at 8, which would give 3 scores of 15 and 3 of 8. This is the lowest total possible, as it spends the points in the least efficient way and gives a total of 69 across the 6 ability scores. This result is in the bottom 26% of roll 4 drop 1 scores. Alternatively, you can raise 3 scores to 12 and 3 more to 13, giving a total of 75 across the 6 ability scores. This is the highest total score, using the most efficient distribution of points, but leaves no noticeably high scores. This total is in the top 40% of Roll 4 Drop 1 values. We can compare the ability score totals for point buy, standard array, 3d6 and Roll 4 Drop 1 in this chart. Standard array always returns the same total score of 72, and this is close to the middle of the scores from point buy, between 69 and 75. For 3d6 and Roll 4 Drop 1, I have used a modified box and whisker plot. This shows the outliers that each make up the top 1% and bottom 1% of results, and then 4 quartiles representing the rest of the distribution split roughly into 25% blocks. Note that due to issues with granularity, some rounding has been done. 3d6 returns some quite poor results, with only the top 25% of results matching the range of results with point buy. About 1% of results beat the total score of point buy. There is a good reason why 3d6 is rarely used and Roll 4 Drop 1 is more popular. On that note, we can see that Roll 4 Drop 1 lines up with point buy quite neatly, the middle 50% of results having a slightly better spread than point buy, and the lower 25% of results matching the middle 50% for 3d6. To show the extreme difference between the two rolling systems, the bottom 25% of results for 3d6 would be the lowest 1% for Roll 4 Drop 1, and the opposite is true at the top. The top 25% of results for Roll 4 Drop 1 roughly matches the top 1% of 3d6. Of course, the total of ability scores is not the only consideration. The number of notably high and low scores is important, and this is true for most roleplay games. Depending on your character archetype, some abilities are more important to some characters than they are to others. Depending on the class being played, a Dungeons & Dragons player might be willing to dump, that is, to take very low values in certain ability scores, commonly strength, intelligence, charisma, or some combination of them, in exchange for some higher values in the abilities important to their chosen class. 2 results of 13 might be less useful than a 17 and an 8, even though the total is higher. Point buy lets you allocate ability scores as you like them, with the restriction that no ability can be raised to over 15. The joy and risk for rolling for ability scores is the chance of getting a really great roll or two. The chance of a 17 or 18 in a couple of key abilities is seen as worth the risk of rolling a 6 or 8 for a couple of abilities that you wouldn't be relying on anyway. The distribution between scores is as important as the total of the scores. How can we fairly compare the 3 systems of standard array, point buy, and rolling using Roll 4 Drop 1? Note, I won't consider 3d6 for this. I will try to qualify their usefulness under 3 categories. Firstly, are they flexible? Do they return a set of ability scores that are roughly in line with the design of the game, and can players use them to build characters that are fun and effective to play? Are they equitable? Are all players in the same group treated fairly? Having one character feel like a superhero when the player next to them is at best a sidekick is less fun for both players. Are they fun? This is a game after all, and character creation is an integral part of that. Creating a character that is special and unique to you begins with filling in a blank character sheet, and those ability scores are a vital part of it. A good system should feel like part of the game and leave players attached to their new character. I will attempt to rank the 3 chosen systems, marking them 1 to 5 in each category. Starting with standard array, I'm going to give the lowest score for flexibility, as the only choice you have is where to assign the scores you are given. There is no swapping points between scores, nothing to be done at all. You would think that this would be a clear case for giving standard array the highest mark for equitability, as all players are treated identically. But this is not the case, as different character classes have different needs, and standard array does not meet these needs. A rogue wants as high a dexterity as possible, and a warlock wants to max out their charisma, and both are not that interested in their other ability scores, so not having the ability to push one score higher hurts them when compared to other classes that require a more balanced spread of ability scores. To counter that, a paladin really wants 3 ability scores as high as possible: strength, constitution and charisma, and the spread of the top 3 results is less advantageous for them. Equality of opportunity is not the same as equality of results. The final category of fun is also a weak spot for standard array. There is little player agency in the system. They are handed a set of values and told to allocate them as they will. This, to me, is not in any way gamey, fun or unique. In total, standard array scores 6 out of 15, a poor start. Point buy scores much higher in flexibility, though the built-in limitations prevent a higher score. It scores very well in equitability as well. It serves both single ability score dependent and multiple ability score dependent characters, known as sad and mad, giving equality in opportunity and equality in outcomes. Its weakest point is the fun category. The point buy system is quite gamey, which I like, but it lacks the fundamental characteristic of Dungeons and Dragons, rolling dice, and to some people it might feel like more of a mathematics exercise. It also feels a little clinical, unable to generate a character that is uniquely you. Point buy scores much better, getting 12 out of 15 points. Roll 4 drop 1 scores poorly for flexibility. It will likely return a similar total to standard array and point buy, with some higher and some lower values, but the randomness prevents a better score. It also scores poorly for equitability. Each character has the same opportunity for their ability scores, but the outcomes can be vastly different. A result in the middle of the lower quartile might be 20 points lower than a result in the middle of the upper quartile. As an aside, I have felt both sides of this. In one of the games I am currently playing, a fellow player rolled a total of 82 points for their abilities, including 2 18s, whereas I rolled 73, with no result over 14. This compares to my other game, where I rolled 82 points, including an 18 and 2 17s, and one of the other players rolled a total of 70. I find these differences to be somewhat unpleasant, irrespective of which side of them I am on. Roll 4 drop 1 scores the best in the fun category. Your results will feel uniquely you, and the dice rolling nature of it feels right for Dungeons and Dragons. Overall it scores 10 out of 15, objectively inferior to point buy. So why do I still like rolling for ability scores? In my own mind, I find the fun category to be weighted more favourably, and the gambler in me yearns for a chance to roll a score higher than 15, the maximum under point buy, even if, on a rational level, I believe that starting characters should not have the best ability scores. But this is only true of Dungeons and Dragons. The best character creation methods I have used have all been point buy. I will point out Edge of the Empire by Fantasy Flight Games, part of its Star Wars roleplay game set, and Scion 2nd edition from Onyx Path, which both have a point buy based system, or a flexible system with some free points at the end for customization. Why does point buy work better for these systems? The points are very flexible in how they are spent, and can be used to buy ability scores, skills and other perks. But with Dungeons and Dragons, they can only be used in one area, making the character creation system feel siloed to some extent, with each section working independently of the others. I favour point buy in almost all games, except Dungeons and Dragons, and my own game will certainly use some kind of point buy system. The scoring system I have made is relatively subjective, and it would be interesting to see how other players rank these systems. Maybe you could give it a go in the comments. I would appreciate that. There is, of course, a big question left. Is there another way to generate ability scores that might score higher on our 3 categories, whilst still being easy to implement? I think there might be, and as you can easily predict, my next video will be all about it. I call it Community Pool Rolling, or CPR. Finally, the philosophy part. The 3 criteria I use to rank the ability score generating systems have applications in many areas in and out of gaming. Flexibility, equitability, and fun are useful metrics for measuring any rule or system. Does it do what it needs to do? Does it do it fairly? And is the process enjoyable? Perhaps this also applies well outside games, in business and personal decision space. This concludes our lesson. If you have any questions or thoughts, please let me know in the comments, as well as your ranking of the ability score generation tools. If you'd like to see my own idea, Community Pool Rolling, you can subscribe and toggle notifications on to be alerted to when I upload it. And as always, enjoy your next game, whatever it may be.